and work very closely with our fabulous surgeons. And I'd like to talk to you tonight about a book I read that really was so fascinating to me, and it's called The Power of Habit. And you can buy this on Amazon. Yeah, it's good. Or Barnes & Noble. It's a book designed for lay people. It's not a scientific book, just for doctors. And I'm going to start talking with a question. What did you do when you first woke up this morning? What is your routine? Did you automatically hit the snooze bar? Did you bounce up and jump in the shower? Did you immediately flip up and see what happened on Facebook while you were sleeping? Did you make a protein shake? Did you watch the news? Did you brush your teeth? Did you brush your teeth before the shower or after the shower? Do you put your left shoe on first or your right shoe on? What was the first thing you did this morning when you sat at your desk? What about yesterday? What about the day before that? Could you tell me what it'll be tomorrow? So a long time ago, a wise man said, all of our life, so far as it has definite form, is but a mass of habits. And 2006, Duke University published a paper saying that, in fact, they believe more than 40% of the actions of a person in any given day are actually habits, not decisions. We like to think we're very decisive people, but in actuality, a lot of that is actually just habit. So this book is divided up into three parts: how habits emerge in our lives, how successful companies use these habits, and how societies develop habits. And the central argument at the end of it all, because it'll be a circuitous route, but I will get back to that habits can change, can be changed if we understand how they work. And anybody who's sat with me in an exam room knows that I'm very big about explaining why, because I am a stubborn redhead. I do not do anything unless I understand why I have to. And I think a lot of people are like that, even though redheads just get the reputation. So the stuff in his book is based on lots of different academic studies. He's not a scientist himself, but he interviewed over 300 scientists and executives. And he did a lot of groundwork research. And one of the things he says, is let's take a look at what a habit is. The choices that all of us deliberately make at some point and then stop thinking about, but continue doing, often every day, are what we refer to, or what he's referring to, as a habit. We stop making a choice to do something, and it becomes an automatic action. So he started getting this interest by observing the military, and he saw how they do, basic training. I mean, these guys is just it's a drill. They're just automatically, they do these things. They load that rifle. They're not thinking. They're trained this way so they can respond appropriately in battle when someone's life depends on it. And so even just from making a bed, these habits that they instill, these lack of decision-making, automatic behaviors, help them focus amid chaos. And he observed this, phenomenon that occurred in Iraq. There was an army major who conducted habit modification program in the small city of Kufa. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. They studied some riots that were going on in this town. And they noticed that crowds of Iraqis would gather and grow in these plazas, in these open areas, as people started having these little, kind of rifts. And food vendors would start to appear because all these people were gathered. And the next thing you know, violence would break out. And they observed that this happened over and over again. People started to gather, more people gathered, they started battling a little bit back and forth, the food vendors showed up, people grabbed a hot dog, sat back and watched the show, and other people just jumped in and started fighting. So this guy met with the mayor of this town, and he said, I just want to try a little experiment. Can you not allow the vendors in the plaza? And let's just see what happens. And so the crowd started gathering as usual, but they ended up becoming restless and hungry, and eventually they went home. And the riot stopped. Who knew? All we had to do was take away a vendor truck to stop riots. Groups and societies develop habits and automated behaviors just like individuals. I'm going to tell you a story about a person named Hugh Eugene, and you can read all about him in this book, but I'll give you the summary. So Eugene was a pretty smart, sharp guy, and one day developed encephalitis, so an inflammation in his brain. And as a result, he had almost complete memory loss. Could not remember a thing. Couldn't remember where he lived, couldn't remember his name. He would repeat the same sentence over and over and over again. Pleasant, but just couldn't remember a single thing anybody said or did, didn't know where he was. When he finally went home, the doctors were like, I'm sorry, there is nothing we're going to be able to do. The majority of his brain is just cooked. There's no hope. So she started taking him on a daily walk. She thought, we've got to get some sort of structure in our lives. And if he asks me one more time what my name is, I'm going to go crazy. So we're going to go for a walk every day. So they started going for walks. And he would have this little habit as they would go. I use that word accidentally. But he would, as they went along on their walks, he would pick up little pine cones and just sort of collected them on their walk. And then he would make a little pile when they got back home on his little bedside, on his little side table where he sat and watched TV. And every single day she would take him on the exact same route. And she did this for weeks, months, and months. One day, he went missing. She's absolutely freaked out, completely panicked, because this is a person who doesn't even know his name, much less his address. She had always kept the door locked. She tried very hard to make sure he didn't get out and go wander, but it just happened one day like it can. She looked everywhere for him. She went to the neighbors. She looked all over, complete panic. She called the police. And finally, after running around 20 times, calling people, asking neighbors to no avail, she went back home. And he was sitting there on the couch. And of course, she said, where have you been? And he was like, what are you talking about? I've been right here. No, you were gone. Well, I don't know. Did I go somewhere? I have no idea. And then she noticed right next to him on the little table, a little pile of pine cones. And she realized, after observing day after day and watching, that he was on his own going and taking the exact same route, picking up his pine cones and coming home. He had no memory of doing this. And so she talked to his doctors, and the doctors were like, that is amazing. How is he doing this? How is he remembering how to get back to the house when he has no memory? And so it started some interesting questions to the doctors, and they started observing some of the things and asking him questions at home, and they'd say, where's the kitchen, Eugene? And he'd say, I have no idea where the kitchen is. And yet, when he was hungry, he would get up and walk to the kitchen and get food. When he had to use the restroom, he would get up and walk to the restroom, but he couldn't tell anybody where the restroom was. So right around this time in the 1990s, a lot of information and interest started coming about looking at the subject of habits and trying to find, how we create them, how can we modify them, and there was a lot of work being done at MIT. And if you think of the brain and you kind of look at this image, you can sort of understand that it's sort of like an onion. And the outer layers of the brain are the more, complex thinking, right? If you look evolutionarily, the more advanced layers. And the deeper parts of the brain are the more, the more ancient things, the more automatic things like breathing. And in the middle of the brain is this kind of golf ball sized lump of tissue that once was very poorly understood that we know is the basal ganglia. And I promise I'm not going to get, too deep into all this detail, but it's important to understand this concept. So there's sort of this little nebulous part of the brain that nobody really knew a whole lot about. They knew that people had certain diseases, this wasn't functioning properly. They noticed that animals who had injuries in this area had a hard time forming habits, and they would teach an animal the same trick over and over and over again, and they just couldn't quite get it. And it was interesting that they noticed that Eugene's brain, when you looked at the images, almost the whole brain was affected by this encephalitis to a permanent degree, but the basal ganglia was normal. So it was unaffected by the encephalitis. So at MIT, they took a little rat and they surgically inserted wires into its brain. And they put it into this little T-shaped contraption, and they put a little block on the door, and they would make a clicking sound and open the door. And the rat would meander throughout this system, trying to learn about it. It would sniff, it would scratch, it would go in circles. It was sort of just erratically made its way around the contraption and eventually found the chocolate in the corner. And they started to evaluate the data of the brain waves and the brain activity within the rat as it initially encountered the maze, and over time after it had sort of streamlined. After a while, the rat no longer stopped every 5 feet to sniff and smell and figure it out. It started to just sort of streamline and go straight to the chocolate. And they noticed that when it got to that part where it was going straight to the chocolate, the parts of the brain that are active, those outer parts of the brain, right, the more complex thinking, the evaluating the situation, started to get quiet. That activity was no longer seen. There was activity at that first click, and there was activity when it got to the chocolate. But the process, the pathway of getting to the chocolate, that part of the brain sort of went to sleep. Even interestingly, the memory part of our brain. Very little brain activity. But what did still have activity was the basal ganglia. If you think about backing out of your driveway, something that the first time you did it took a lot of concentration. Think about every step, and I've listed them there. You open the garage, you unlock the door, you insert the key, you turn the key clockwise, you check the rear view mirror, the side mirrors, you put your foot on the brake, you move the gear shift into reverse, you remove your foot from the brake, you estimate the distance between the garage and the street, you keep the wheels aligned. While you're watching for oncoming traffic, you're calculating how the images in the mirrors translate to real distance from the car, how to apply slight pressure to the gas pedal. That's a lot of thinking. Are you completely debilitated when you're backing out of your garage every day? Do you have to be like, okay, stop everything, I'm backing out of the garage? No, you just do it. Right? It's a habit. Why does our brain need to do this? Why does our brain have this system whereby half of it can shut down when we're doing something that's important, obviously, because we do it a bunch of times a day? Well, if we think about it, we want to be efficient, right? Our brain wants to be efficient. We want less room. We don't want brains the size, of a Toyota. We want smaller heads, right? Smaller heads. Look from a biological standpoint, we've got to give birth to children. We need little heads. They've got to be able to get through the birth canal, right? Who's all for little heads? Right here. You don't want to have to think super hard about walking, about chewing, about basic things. If that is taking up all of your outer cortex, then there's no room for things like ideas. Like, let's find a way to cut something. Let's find a way to make us move this cart, i.e. invent a wheel. So we have to be able to shut some of the active thinking down so that we can move on to the higher and more complex functions. Active thinking occurs at the beginning and it occurs at the end. And what they've started noticing is the active thinking in the beginning seems to be somewhat of a cue. Right? So the rat would hear a click and it would get this peak of activity. And then the active thinking went away, right? While it was going through its routine. And then when the reward appeared, the brain sort of shifted itself awake and we saw active thinking again. And thus was born this diagram called the habit loop. And this is really fundamental, so stare at it for a minute because the rest of the talk is really based off of this, and the reason why you shop at Target is based off of this. Anyone in marketing, anyone trying to sell you anything understands this concept very well. There's a cue, there's a routine, and there's a reward. And interestingly, there's an arrow that goes from the reward back to that cue, making it a loop, which we'll go into these. We'll kind of dissect this. We're going to start with the reward, and I'm going to tell you about Julio the Monkey. So Julio the Monkey, they did a very similar study, or method of study as they did with the rats. They put a bunch of little wires on his brain, and they gave him a little TV to watch and a little lever to pull, and they put a little tube, straw, and it went to his mouth. And they would show on this little TV screen certain colored shapes. And whenever they would show a certain colored shape and he pulled the trigger, he would get a drip of blackberry juice. And he liked blackberry juice. So even though initially he wasn't really interested, and it took a while to figure out that you have to pull this thing, you see that, and then I pull this, and then I get blackberry juice. If I just see that, I don't get the blackberry juice. If I see that and I pull this, I get the blackberry juice. And eventually he learned this, and he started staring at the screen, waiting for that image, because he knew and wanted that shape to appear so that he could get that reward. And what was interesting is they saw a spike in the pleasure part of his brain when he would get that reward. Similar to any other pleasure we receive in life, when we eat specific foods, especially some more than others, we get a little pleasure surge in our brain. Same parts of our brain that light up with many drugs, cocaine and heroin, alcohol, and so forth. Many foods activate that same pleasure sensor. What was even more interesting, so here's his habit loop, right? There's this cue, the routine is pulling the lever, and the reward is the blackberry juice. So what was really interesting, what happened after that, is how things changed as the experiment progressed. That habit became stronger. So they started noticing that activity in the pleasure part of the brain would start occurring even just at the sight of the shapes, even before he received the blackberry juice. That pleasure part of the brain was activated. I think you see where I'm going with this. So let's talk about the cues, right, in our habit loop. The cue is what triggers the habit, right? A cue can be many different things. It can be anything. It's frequently things like an image, a sound. In our rat case, it was the click, right? There was that click every time. It could be an emotion. It could be a smell. It could be a time of day. It could be in anything. For example, tell me what happens when you see this. Right? It's something interesting. If you think about, and I don't know, Cinnabon isn't very huge here, but we did our residency in Denver. And in the mall in Denver, I noticed that the Cinnabon shop was 4 or 5 stores away from the food court. And I always thought it was just because nothing was near the food court was available. So they had to be over there between, the Hallmark and J. Crew. And as I was reading through this, it was explained to me why that is. Because, exactly, Cinnabon understood that they needed to create a cue that they could control. And they didn't want the smell of their cinnamon rolls to be mixed in with the Sbarro pizza smell. They wanted to hit you first, before you made it to the food court, to start that cue. Let's talk a minute about fast food habit, because it's something that most people can relate to. How many families start out, you get married, you have your kids, we're so happy, we just can't wait to start eating fast food every night of the week. Nobody sets out with that goal. It very frequently starts out as just this one time because the kids are screaming and soccer went late and I have a presentation in the morning, and it's fast and it's cheap and it's delicious and it makes the kids happy. And one time leads to another time, leads to another time, because habits do not ask our permission before being formed. We have all kinds of cues here in this loop, right? We have stress, we have chaos, we have hunger. The routine, of course, is going to the drive-thru. And the reward is great. It's peace in the family. It's happy kids. It's a really yummy, flavorful satisfaction of our hunger. So the cues and the rewards create a habit. Interestingly, many fast food chains, they all know these things, right? This might be news to us, but they've known this for a long time. Many fast food chains actually engineer their French fries to start dissolving the second they hit your tongue, to ensure an immediate pleasure spike the second you start eating their food. You want that grease and that salt and that carb combination as instantly as possible to trigger that pleasure sensation in your brain. Doesn't it make you a little bit mad to think about how we are being manipulated? It makes me mad. So, what's a human to do? We'll come back to that. Let's talk a little bit more about this monkey experiment. They started playing around with poor little Julio. They watered down his juice. They would delay the juice time, the response time after he pulled the trigger. They did all kinds of different little things. And Julio became very upset. When he saw the cue, we saw that anticipation, right? We saw that pleasure spike go up before he even got his juice. And when he didn't get the juice, or when the juice was diluted, or when it came too late, he would become angry. He became aggravated. And they started saying, "No, that's interesting." So the loop isn't being completed, but he's not just getting confused. He's getting downright mad. He's emotionally involved in this process now. The power of habit is that it creates neurologic cravings. The craving is the key here, because without the craving, right, it's just a pattern. But the craving is what makes it continue. The craving is what makes us, when we go back to Julio, have that pleasure spike when we see the cue. We haven't even gotten to the reward yet, but we're seeing the pleasure spike just at the cue. And that is the birth of a craving. And cravings are what fuel habits, good or bad. So these are just some examples. All right, we have a fight, I go gambling, I get some money, I feel better. Or I'm exhausted and stressed out and I'm about to pull my hair out and I pull out a cigarette and then I feel better. Or I'm exhausted and I have 3 cups of coffee and I wake up. We have a cue, a routine, a reward, and our brain starts perceiving, when I get this cue, I get to that reward, and I start craving that reward every time I see that cue. So how easy is it for you when you hear the ding that says you have a text message? How many people say, "I'll look at that later"? How many people hear that ding and it's, "Oh my God, where's my purse? Where's my God, where's the drawers? Where's my," we drop everything to find that phone and see what that message is. We are trained. That is a habit. That is what is the reward? Well, it's communication. It's information. It's the power of habit is extremely strong, and cravings bring us to our knees. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, it makes you sort of angry when you think about how businesses and companies can feed into that, take advantage of that. I'll tell you a really interesting story about the company of Febreze. where I was getting to a minute ago is it's not just enough to have the cue and the reward, right? We have to create something such that there's a craving that makes you, as soon as you see that cue, you crave the reward. So they met with this woman who had a lot of cats, and her cat smelled really bad. And so the Febreze people, when they first came out, I don't know if many of you remember this, but back when it was first introduced, it didn't have an odor. It eliminated odors. Does anybody else remember this? Right? And that was its big thing. We're not Glade. We're not going to cover up the smell. We're going to make the smell go away. And it sounds like a really great idea, right? Because who wants cats and roses? Right? You just want a clean smelling house. And so this woman with the cats, and she sprayed the Febreze, and she was like, this is great. I don't smell my cats. Nobody else smells my cats. And so they said, they looked at each other and they go, we are going to make a killing on this thing. So they put out this big marketing thing, and they went on and on about how we're going to eliminate bad odors. We make it all go away. And they marketed, we're going to make your bad smells go away. And nothing happened. They didn't sell any Febreze. They were going to go bankrupt. They went back to the lady with the cats and they said, how's it going with the Febreze? And she's like, oh, I ran out. You didn't get any more? Nah. But your house smells like cats again. But I'm really kind of used to the smell. I don't really notice it anymore. So back to the drawing board. They studied and studied housewives, homemakers, people who did this kind of stuff all the time, their key market, and they observed them. And one of the things was that they discovered is after completing a task, being it making the bed or doing the dishes or vacuuming a room, every person had some little celebration, if you will, at the end. It might be or it might be but there was something. Some people would yawn or stretch or just look around and smile. Anything. There was always a little bitty reward. And they went, that's what we're missing. Because the lack of something is not a reward. The lack of a bad smell is not a reward. It's the lack of a bad smell. Febreze had no reward. There was a cue, right? There was a routine of spraying, but there was no reward. And without that cue and a reward, you cannot create a craving. So, introducing scented Febreze. And they changed all their advertising. They no longer said, we eliminate odors, we don't just cover them up. As a matter of fact, they quit saying we eliminate odors altogether. They started showing ads of women doing these tasks of vacuuming the room and squirt, squirt, and then smile. Or making the bed and squirt, squirt, and happiness. Little roses and, appeared in the background. And they started making you think, oh, I want that little happiness after I make the bed or after I vacuum the room. And so people started using it at the end of a task, and they began expecting that fresh smell at the end of cleaning. And they now had created a craveable reward. There's our habit loop. The cue, the routine of the spray, and the reward of the pretty smell. So they relaunched in 1998, and within 2 months, their sales had increased by 100%. And within the first year, consumers had spent over $230 million on this product. Not because it eliminated bad odors, because when it just eliminated bad odors, nobody bought it. But because they had created something for you to crave. Pepsodent is another interesting story. Back in the day, there was no way to really clean your teeth, right? Who's the famous queen who used to go watch Shakespeare, and she would never, no mirrors were allowed in the castle because her teeth were all black, and they didn't want her to see that she looked very scary. We watch Little House on the Prairie all the time in my house, and it really drives me crazy. Every night they finish dinner and they go, night ma, night pa, and off they go to bed. And I'm like, your teeth, gotta brush your teeth. So they came up with Pepsodent, fantastic observation that fluoride helps prevent dental caries. And they've set out and taught people, look, that yucky film on your teeth, that goes away when you brush with Pepsodent. Those tooth decay that you get, that'll go away if you brush with Pepsodent. So some people used it and people no longer had dental decay and they were happy, but most people wouldn't buy the toothpaste. They knew that it would prevent dental problems. They knew that they wouldn't have sweaters on their teeth in the morning, but they just didn't make it a habit. It just did not become a habit to buy Pepsodent. So, understanding the habit loop, they said, okay, what's our cue? Our cue, well, they're still waking up in the morning with sweaters on their teeth. There's plenty of cues. Their teeth hurt when they get cavities. There's all kinds of cues. The routine is brushing their teeth. You can't get them to do that. Why? Well, because what's the reward? And again, the lack of sweaters on your teeth isn't a reward. The lack of tooth decay isn't a craveable reward. I mean, it's a reward in and of itself, but it's not a craveable reward. So they started adding a little bit of citric acid, and they started adding a little bit of mint oil to the toothpaste. Guess what happened? People started brushing their teeth. Never mind the fact that they didn't have tooth decay, and they weren't having teeth pulled and so on and so forth. They had a minty fresh taste that tingled a little bit in their mouth at the end of the process. There was a craveable reward. Enter craving and habit loop, and a company's making a lot of money. Now in this situation, thank goodness, because we'd all be like that queen, who couldn't look in the mirror because her teeth were all black. But it's the power of habit. The power of habit really rules the world. When you are creating a habit, you've got to create a cue. You've got to create a reward. And that habit you're trying to develop is your routine, right? And your goal, of course, is to develop the craving so that you can make this a loop. New Mexico State University in 2002 did a study looking at 266 people who worked out at least 3 times a week. And they wanted to know, how did these people create this habit? So they looked at trying to figure out, what are the parts of the loop? We've got to make a loop, right? If it's a habit, we've got to find out what the loop is. What's the cue? The routine we know is exercise. But what's the cue and what's the reward? So when they asked these people, what cues you to exercise on these days, they got a variety of answers, but every person had a cue, every single person. So either they set the alarm at a certain time, different than their usual time. So when you wake up, you hear that alarm, the sunlight is different. Where you are in your sleep cycle is different. It's unique. It's different from when they usually wake up. Some people would leave their tennis shoes right by the bed or leave out their workout clothes. But it varied. But each person had a cue. And then the reward, it turns out when they study these people, most often was endorphins, just that sense of accomplishment. But those endorphins are powerful, as Nike knows, because Nike uses that in its advertising, right? It's teasing you with that reward of endorphins, as in this example. Endorphins are a craveable reward. And this is a good example of how habits can facilitate. Of course, as people are still trying to make money off of us using this. Doesn't stop that. Here's the runner's habit loop. You have a driving force, or craving, so you create your cue, you develop your routine, and you come up with your reward. How do we change a habit, right? So I've got a habit that I don't like. What can I do about it? So first you have to dissect the framework. You've got to identify, what is your routine, right? What is that habit that you're trying to change? And then you want to experiment with different rewards, and you want to isolate your cue. Then you need to have a plan. So if we examine our cue, the cue is not going to change, right? Because the cue is what triggers this habit we're trying to change. So my cue here is stress. I'm stressed out. My usual routine, not mine really, but this person's usual routine is to have a few cocktails, and then he feels happy, he feels chill, and it's all good. But he wants to change that. He doesn't want that to be his usual routine. He wants the same reward of accomplishment and relaxation and not being stressed. The cue is what it is. It's there. So we've got to create a different bridge from that cue to that reward. Okay, so if we don't create a new way to get there, we're stuck with the old route. So we have the same cue, same reward. We've got to create an alternative bridge. And these don't ever go away, by the way. I hate to tell you. That this bridge will always be there. And as anyone who struggles with alcoholism can attest to. It's always there. When they took those rats that I taught you about earlier and they put them in that tunnel and they changed things up for a while, they put them in a different maze with chocolate, but they did, other different things. They went months and months without putting them in that T shape with the chocolate. To the point we're thinking there's no way this rat is going to remember this. And then later, many, many months later, they put the rat in that T and boom, right to it. These habits will not go away. But we can find alternate routes and alternate bridges to get to that same reward, to compete. So Mandy was a perpetual nail biter. And she finally figured out and identified her cue was finding rough edges, like I have right now, on her fingernails. Or hangnails, and she'd slide her fingers together. And she realized that this caused her to bite her nails. She got great satisfaction from biting her nails and finding that things were then smooth on the other end. So she was participating in this study that was studying habits, and they told her every time she ran her fingers over each other looking for roughness to mark it on an index card. And in the course of 1 week, she had 28 check marks. So she developed this awareness of what her cue was and found out that this occurred during class or while watching television. That's when she would do this. And so she decided to develop a competing response to finding those rough edges. And the one she chose was wrapping her knuckles on a counter. So instead of feeling this and putting it in my mouth, I'm creating an alternate bridge to that reward of smooth nails or, feeling like I need to do something with my fingers by wrapping on the desk. Eventually she'd get up and go get a nail file, right? But that immediate response was to wrap her fingers. And she discovered a week later that her index card only had three times where she had felt her nails rough and gone on to nail biting. Just by creating an alternate bridge to that cue. So at the core of every habit, our cue, our routine, and our reward. First step, changing a habit, is identify what your components are of your loop. So step one, identify the routine, right? The routine is what we want to change. We don't ever want to change the reward, and we can't usually fix the cue. We're going to drive by that McDonald's sign. They're going to make sure you see it. And as you go through the mall, they're going to make sure you smell Cinnabon. So our first step is let's identify the routine. What is my routine? My routine is pulling into McDonald's. My routine is pulling out the bourbon. And then you're going to experiment with different rewards. The next step is to isolate exactly what your cue is. And then the last step, of course, is to make your plan. So step one, identify the routine. So we look at this person, Joe, who had a habit of going to the cafeteria every afternoon and getting a chocolate chip cookie and visiting with people. And he felt really good when all this was happening, when he's hanging out, chatting, and eating. But then, of course, he felt bad. And over the course of time since he got this job doing this, he gained 8 pounds. Trying to change it, setting up Post-it notes and pictures of a thinner version, saying I'll change tomorrow, that was all there. But he couldn't really make any progress. The routine in this loop is going to the cafeteria, right? So our first step is identifying our routine. What is it we want to change? I want to stop going to the cafeteria to eat a chocolate chip cookie. When you're looking at, I've got my reward, my cue, I've got my reward, I'm trying to change this routine, you've got to identify what that craving is. because that craving is what causes that to become a loop, right? To continue. So what causes this routine? Is it hunger? Am I going to the cafeteria because I'm hungry? Am I bored with what I'm doing? Do I just need a break? And what is my reward? Is my reward the cookie itself? Is it getting away from my desk? Is it the temporary distraction of visiting with someone else? Is it socializing with my colleagues? Or is it the burst of energy that I get from the sugar? So experimenting with rewards can help you identify that craving. So you're gonna, you can be a scientist. This picture of somebody making all these, the scientific notes. Think about how am I going to identify what exactly it is that I'm after? What is my reward? Is my reward the satisfaction of hunger? Is my reward to visit with people? Is my reward a change of scenery? I'm not sure. All I just know is that I go to the cafeteria, I get the chocolate chip cookie, I talk to Susie, and I feel happy. That's what I know. So we got to experiment. Get out a little notebook, and let's try a few different things. Instead of walking to the cafeteria, go outside one day. Walk around the block, and then return to your desk without a snack. The next day, try going to the cafeteria, but buying something different, like an apple. Or even some other sweet, but something different, and eat it at your desk. The next time, try going to the cafe, buy an apple, and eat it while you're socializing with other people. Try it with a cup of coffee instead of an apple. Instead of going to the cafe, maybe go to your friend's office, and then go back to your desk without a snack at all. And when you're doing this, try to hypothesize and determine which craving is driving your routine. So if it's the cookie, is it because you're hungry? If it's because you're hungry, then on the day that you have the apple, you're going to feel that same level of satisfaction. But on the day you take the walk, you won't. Right? If it's the socialization, then the day you don't eat anything but you go visit with your friend, you'll still have that same satisfaction at the end. But if you go and you have something else to eat, you won't. So you isolate. Is it really when I take out the food and I just socialize, I feel just as satisfied when I sit back down? Well, then it's the socialization that I'm after. If I'm just as satisfied after I have a sandwich instead of a cookie, then I know that it's hunger. That's my trigger for this craving. If it's coffee, it works just as well. Then I know that I need a burst of energy. So you write all these things down. You get out of your notebook and you write these things down and try to figure it out. What is happening? And this is not an overnight thing. This can take weeks, right? But I'm trying to plan this out. I'm trying to figure it out. So look for those patterns. Write down when you get there how you're feeling. Do you feel relaxed? I'm relaxed. I saw flowers and I'm not hungry. Or I'm not relaxed. I saw so-and-so was on Facebook not doing his work and I'm still starving. Right? Whatever it is. And then set your alarm for about 15 minutes and ask yourself, do you still feel the urge to go get that cookie? And that's how you evaluate ultimately, am I back at my desk, is my need satisfied or not? You don't decide as soon as you get back to your desk. You give yourself 15 minutes to get back into your rhythm of whatever else you're doing, and then you ask yourself, okay, where am I? Do I still feel that craving for that cookie? If 15 minutes after chatting with your friend, we kind of did this already, but if 15 minutes later you just chatted with your friend, you didn't get a snack, you're back to work, and your alarm goes off at 15 minutes, and you're like, you know what? No, I don't really want that cookie anymore. Then you've isolated. Okay, then it was the conversation that I really need. And now you have a bridge to change that habit, right? You know you don't need to go to the cafeteria. You could just go over to Heidi's desk and visit. You've created an alternate bridge. So lastly is to isolate the cue. So ask a couple questions yourself. Do you eat breakfast at 7:30 every day because your clock says it's 7:30? Or because you're really hungry at 7:30? Or because that's when you fix your kids' breakfast? Did you accidentally drive to work instead of school today because why? I have no idea why I'm at work. I meant to go to school. Has that ever happened to anybody? What caused that mistake? What was the cue that triggered drive to work instead of drive to school? So back to research, right? Cues almost always fit into 5 categories: location, time, emotional state, other people, or the immediately preceding action. So back to our cookie snack example. Write down 5 things the moment the urge hits. Where are you? Okay, so I'm writing every day. I've got my index card and I'm writing, okay, I'm sitting at my desk, or I'm walking back from the copier, or I'm in the conference room. What time is it? Okay, it's 3:36, it's 3:18, it was 3:41 when I had this craving. What's your emotional state? I'm bored, I'm happy, I'm tired, but I'm excited about the project I'm working on. And who else is around? No one. Sally, the other editors in the meeting. And what action preceded the urge? Answering email, making a photocopy, or sitting down because the meeting was started. So if you're looking at this data, what is your cue? We've isolated the cue with these examples. Can you see what is the one thing that's consistent every time? Yeah, it always happens about 3:30. I can be doing different things. I can be in different emotional states. I can be around a variety of people. The preceding action varies, but it's always around 3:30. So I've isolated that cue. The last step, so we've figured out our reward, how to isolate the reward. We figured out how to isolate our cue. We already know what the routine is because that's what we want to change. So the last step is we have to make a plan. Duhigg says a habit is a choice that we deliberately make at some point and then stop thinking about but continue doing every day. So to change the formula of our habit loop, we have to start making choices again. We have to quit being automatic. We have to make that lull during that habit process. We've got to make that all active brain waves again. So at 3:30 every day, I will go to Carol's desk and I will visit for 10 minutes and I will set my alarm for 3:30. That's my plan. I'm going to set my alarm because I want to be ahead of this game. I don't want to be behind it. I want to anticipate before I get that urge. So I'm going to set my alarm. So I'm staying in control here. And then I'm going to go to Carol's desk and I'm going to visit for 10 minutes. And I have hence created a new routine. This doesn't happen. I mean, this sounds really easy, right? I'm just gonna write these things down and I'll just nip that habit right in the bud. But it's very doable because you have an understanding of why your brain is doing the things it's doing, why you are doing the things you're doing. It's not because you're just a weak person or because of you have no willpower. There are neurologic processes going on that are shutting out the active part of your brain when you receive these certain cues. And very often, if your active part of the cortex were thinking about it, you could make a different choice. But it's very frequently not involved in the equation. It is busy thinking about something else. So this is sort of an interesting diagram. It kind of takes everything we've talked about, and what we can do is download it. Maybe Heidi, you can help me, and we'll put it in our dietary and education section of the website, so anybody who wants to can go and download it or print it. But when you want to change a habit, first you got to remember your habit loop. You got to, number one, isolate your cue. Find out what it is. Just like this, we did at that example, we found out that it was the time. The time was the same thing. So you go and you ask yourself, what time of day is it? Where am I? Who else is around? What did I just do? And how am I feeling? Find out what your cue is. And then you figure out what your reward is. When you're when you're, is your reward the cookie because is your reward satisfying hunger? Is it satisfying boredom? Is it satisfying the desire to go visit with your friends? So you figure out what your actual reward is, because your first thought is my reward is the cookie. Well, no, that's your routine. Your routine is getting the cookie. Why are you getting the cookie? Figure out what the reward is, because it's very rarely hunger. And then lastly, let's identify an alternate routine. And this kind of, they find that people really tend to do better when you write it out. And you can see on the bottom right there, when blank, I will blank because it provides me with blank. So this is my plan. I've done step 1, 2, and 3. And when bored, I will take a walk because it provides me with a clear head. Lay it all out so you know what you're doing and commit to that. And at the end of the day, the bottom line is you got to believe in yourself. You got to believe that you can do this, because beliefs will pull you through when habits falter. Many people find seeking a higher power is very helpful. Alcoholics Anonymous, we can learn a lot from them because the struggle is very similar. And that's one of the key steps in AA, is acknowledging praying to a higher power. And it seems ridiculously simple, says Nathan Azrin, but once you're aware of how your habit works, and once you recognize the cues and rewards, you're halfway to changing it. The brain can be reprogrammed, but you have to be deliberate about it. You can't just say, I really wish I could just start exercising, because that won't get you there. Create a cue to develop the routine, define your reward so you can create habit. And don't give up. It won't always work the first time. You may think you've figured out your cue or figured out your reward, and it's not working. And you may have to back up and go back up to your research and say, you know what, this clearly is not consistently helping me. I'm going to start back over and reevaluate what my cue is or what my reward is. There's nothing you can't do if you get the habits right. So, thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yes, sir. Okay, the question was about the website. So what we'll do, if you're anybody who's interested in downloading this kind of summary of the process of habit change, on the website, if you go under our patient support section, there's a section for diet and nutrition education. And we can post it in there. You need a password for that, and you should have it somewhere in your paperwork, but the password, in case you don't, is FIT for life. F-I-T, and then the number 4, and then life, L-I-F-E, no spaces. And so Heidi will help me get that up there tomorrow, if you'd like to download this. Thank you.